I'm thinking in a choreographic framework, if I think of this, I think of sound as a propellant. It's something that actually moves people throughout the rooms. And I'm not sure if it's at the back of the person, like a wind at their back, or if it is like a magnet to their front, their attraction or repellence from these sounds. I'm not quite sure, how it will work, but I do see it as the primary choreographic propellant.
So let's start with the genesis of the project, the sense of things. Miriam, can you tell us about Bill as your choice of artist to open Chipperfield's immense new Kunsthaus extension, which is a project long in the works?
The idea for the project started when I heard that there will be a moment when the museum is basically built and ready, but somehow not capable of showing already the classic holdings we have, like the collection or classic formats of art, because of lost climate adjustments, tests, and also because of the concrete walls that take a long time to dry out. So I found this moment particularly interesting, let's say, to have a museum ready, but in an empty state, something that you never basically encounter. Museums tend to be overfull with artworks, and so I was very fascinated by this moment, and I thought it would be really interesting to kind of create a proposal that would put this immense architectural body in a relation with the body of the visitors that will visit then the museum. I didn't intend to have dancers doing a choreographic piece in the empty museum. I was thinking of someone who could create this relation of these two bodies, of this, the body of the architecture, the body of the visitors. And with Bill's enlarged notion of choreography and also his body of works called Choreographic Objects, where he basically creates settings or environments that trigger the visitors to move differently through spaces and to be aware of their relation with the space surrounding them, with their own body, their body movement, and so on. So I thought that would be really interesting to start a discussion with Bill. And this is how I contacted him. And it was, I guess, 4 years ago, something like that, when we started.
So well pre-COVID, which is interesting because the format that the show takes, in fact, is primarily sonic. And so arrives at visitors as a kind of remote sonic touch that feels somehow highly pertinent within COVID.
The idea was to have actually no occupation, which would be like a non-intervention intervention. So
we didn't want to produce, let's say, objects or like physical material somehow to occupy the space, but we wanted to work with this emptiness as a core idea for the setting and for this overall experience. So it was something that had to somehow, fill the museum, but still keep it empty.
Which this idea led down some interesting paths. We had a number of solutions. I think I had a total of 4 or 5 solutions for this situation, all of which were canceled by COVID. Everything would have involved too much contact, too much interaction with people. They weren't dancerly, but they did involve, let's say, proximity. And so we really, interestingly enough, were guided by this situation that we're in and had to come up with a solution how to make people curious about the building, how to motivate them to move through the building, but somehow keep their distance.
Yeah, somehow then suddenly this idea with these bells came up. And why church bells?
The idea of bells came specifically from my thoughts about the Burle collection and the fact that I knew that there were these Glockenfriedhöfe, these bell cemeteries that were organized to produce arms. In other words, the bells were melted down and produced weapons. So I thought that was like a ghostly visitation. Survivors, let's say, even though they're not technically survivors, which I thought in some way was an interesting parallel with the collection in the other part of the building versus the Merzbacher collection. And so dealing with a very simple idea like that, but then it began to morph as I thought about the change in Europe in the 1500s, how the rediscovery of Lucretius, how the scientific mentality versus the religious mentality, the iconoclasm of thought that really affected the history of Zurich, and tried to sort of weave everything together. An empty building that's experienced an inadvertent iconoclasm. We have a building essentially devoid of art, but the building is dedicated to art, which in itself is a bit of a paradox. So the idea would be, how could we present this building, which has its own artistic ambitions architecturally, how could we present this to a public that normally does not have access to the art? That the experience of the building would be available to another demographic, which would be people who are either have no access to vision or partial access to vision, and also to deaf people. So people who do not have access to the sense of hearing. And that we would somehow try to make this event privilege those people versus the people who would go to a museum for primarily, or to spectate, to use their vision, to have experiences.
Normally, it's let's say, the main sense that is activated in a museum is the visual sense. And I think now what was really interesting, let's say, to try other ways of activating the other senses that are not so much in focus, let's say, in an art museum, because this is the first artistic intervention in this museum. And I thought it would be really interesting to show what a museum of the 21st century can be, other than just a site of where you show paintings and sculptures and you show art in a classical way. So I thought it would be really interesting to activate the body experience somehow in the museum.
Key to the show is the fact that we have interpreters who are non-hearing and non-sighted, as well as children and a campanologist, or a bell expert, as they're called. These guides will help unfold just what it is that we're talking about in terms of alternative and often more pointed sensory knowledges at play. And in fact, another related layer is the fact that we have no map of the show. There is no program per se, but the invitation is instead is that visitors will echolocate themselves in relation to the bells and sounds and vibrations as they encounter them throughout the building.
Also, I was thinking about privilege. The classic museum setup privileges a certain group of people. And this is removing that privilege and saying to the sighted, this show is not exclusively for you. This is really something that is open to a wider spectrum of perceptions.
And in fact, it is even less accessible to you, sighted people.
Absolutely. They're in the same condition that the non-sighted people are normally in. And also the deaf. Their perceptions are not attuned the same way as the blind. Sighted people's perceptions are, in a certain sense, stumped or made dull in a certain way by the privilege of vision.
I think it's interesting to question this sovereignty of interpretation somehow, that the museum tells people what art is somehow, and how to experience art. And especially now for this first encounter with the museum, I thought it would be really important to question that attitude also, and to open it up and to give people a voice and a platform that would normally not have this possibility to do so. Normally, we have a program, an educational program, and we work also with non-hearing or non-sighted people. But then it's always kind of telling what they don't see. And now it's totally different. I just had this first encounter with two of the guides during the preparation, and already that kind of opened my eyes, because I didn't see anything. Somehow I felt, I mean, they told me about how they would experience the sound through vibration, or also what kind of tone the bell would ring, which I didn't hear, so a completely different sense. And I think that's very, very interesting to have this possibility to learn from non-sighted people how to experience the world.
In so doing, it sets up a knowledge exchange and makes me think of how, Bill, you have described your choreographic installations as being epistemological environments.
It's a way of knowing. It's very similar to your normal curation in some sense. You set up, when you're hanging a show, for example, you're very aware of the suite of encounters, what will happen next. And you're being very choreographic with that. You're basically saying this experience and that experience and so on and so forth. And there is a highly directed experience. We're doing the same thing, but we're giving people more autonomy. We're saying, here is an acoustic environment, not a visual environment, and you get to tune this to your own ear. You experience the museum autonomously. No one is going to tell you how to figure out the architecture in this museum, except using your ear, you might be able to understand the new building. And that's just curiosity. So we're hoping that people will simply develop a curiosity for the origin of these sounds and direct themselves through the building.
I think that's key to this project, and it is questioning the museum and all the rules that normally are kind of in place in the museum. As you say, a show has a specific parkour and or a certain chronological order, and we kind of put this all upside down. Also, I think it's a gesture of empowerment of the visitors. They decide themselves where to go first, and this kind of treasure hunt. You go to the museum and you hear something, and then you don't know where it is located. And I love the idea that it's based on curiosity, so that basically everybody decides on where to go first, and that there's no order or rule you have to follow, and you have to go first to that room, So, but you go, and I'm actually also curious to see how people will react to it. It's a completely different experience than what you normally have in a museum. This kind of being lost for a moment maybe is really crucial and super important, and especially for current times, I feel, where there's so much rules imposed, and you have to do that, you have to do this, you cannot do that.
That's an interesting thing, that the rules are generated, or not even rules. People are trying to understand. They're trying to understand the situation they're in. So they're trying to put pieces together. They construct it.
There's an aesthetic of orientation at work, which is also the iconoclasm. So there is an imagelessness, but a need for visitors to play compass onto their movements, onto their motions.
I'm curious to what degree the sound of the bells will erase the idea of image. People will be so focused on that particular sense that the visual becomes really something in the background.
If you talk about iconoclasm, of course, it's interesting to mention that just a few not even 100 meters, but just basically behind the Kunsthaus, there was the home of Zwingli, one of the key figures for Swiss Reformation.
An entry point for the composition are those sequences that would never be deployed for liturgical usage in churches, and as well as those sequences that are archetypal in bell ringing, so that we can avoid them and work towards something that is an antithesis of such sounds.
Also, there's the fact that these bells are rung from the outside and not from the inside.
As soon as bells are rung, or struck rather, from the outside, they become not bells, but chimes, technically speaking. But what happens in that inversion is symbolically huge and makes them no longer liturgical instruments, but freed as instruments of alterity. And it also emphasizes just how transcultural bells are as objects. They're no longer simply Western Christian instruments, but relate them to the long history of bell devices made from materials that are far from bronze.
Yes, you have Buddhist bells. You have had in ancient China the first bells produced. So I think this is a very important thought, because of church bells are also related to the history of colonialism. If you look at let's say what has been done in the name of Christianity. And so I think this is a small gesture, but a very key change that you conceived for that project.
Yes.
Bells inhabit all kinds of let's say, political costumes, yeah? There's also the phrase saved by the bell, as it were. So bells have been involved in an unimaginable palette of experiences, yeah? They have been used, obviously, to weaponize religion, to suppress, but they've also prevented catastrophes too. So it's not the bells, it's the ringers who we need to look at.
Yeah, and also in traditional or alternative healing methods that are working with the vibrations that go through the body, which is also something that you will experience in this intervention. It is a very physical experience that you will have. I mean, it's something completely different from what the sound of a bell that you hear from a distance. I mean, the position you're normally in when you hear church bells ringing. So it becomes very physical.
That's what we're hoping, Miriam. We're hoping that the experience is really empirical. It's a sense experience of a deeper order, actually having the bells physically move you, not just the tympanum in your ears, but rather your skin or your clothes. You know, there's the notion of a death knell, Knell, a death knell, which is a bell signal of impending death. This was a little bit also my consideration thinking about our museums of the future. You know, rather a question. What form will art take in, let's say, 150 years if we manage to survive that long as a civilization? You know, right now, all these resources are being devoted to the current state of affairs. But one wonders if the whole process of institutionalization within these type of architectures, it's like building a cathedral at a certain point in time would be questionable. And it was the printing press that made cathedral architecture useless in a way. So one wonders, with this current technological shift, if we're actually experiencing this death knell for a way of presenting ideas formerly known as art.
But I think that's, if you look at the impossibility of recording this intervention somehow on digital devices, you have to experience it live. You have to be there, like physically in proximity.
Right, that's
of
true.
this bell,
That's true.
you know? So that's a very crucial question that you're posing. But I think that there are these limits to digital representation, and that the museum, if you understand it also as a building for encounter, and that plays really an important role for civic society, where it's not only about storage of painting and archiving, but to create meaningful experiences for the visitors that leave somehow an impression.
I'd like to go back to the fact that we don't have a map of the museum. We are not providing a map. And I think that is a really significant part of the project, is this acoustic orientation or echolocating.
Practiced by whales and bats.
Porpoises.
Is a kind of proto-sonar in oceanography.
Nice to be in the ocean and the mountains at the same time.
If you would like to say anything about the lack of augmentation or amplification within the spaces of the exhibition.
We have the kind of very Protestant moment on the first floor. There's no amplification. It's just the building and the bells, right? And then as we move up higher, the building itself begins to perform. And in one room, which we call the bright room, the illumination system of the building, which has otherwise been completely turned off, so we have the naked building, is coordinated with the striking of the bells so that we go to the brightest possible illumination in that gallery when the bells are struck.
It is spectacular. It kind of turns you blind.
So there's no dancers, there's no, performers per se, except the visitors who are themselves the actors. But the building then begins to perform. And then opposite that, we have another kind of performance, which is a purely acoustic performance in which we amplify the lower frequencies of the bell in that room and broadcast that through very strong subwoofers, which creates another profile of the bell's acoustics and actually causes the building to shake. So the building actually moves according to those parameters that the bells produce, acoustic parameters that the bells produce.
Maybe it's because it's in this room of the Burle collection, but I was also thinking of this sonic warfare, to quote Steve Goodman.
Yes. He writes, a vibratory nexus exceeds and precedes the distinction between subject and object, constituting a mesh of relation in which discrete entities prehend each other's vibrations.
So the bells sense us. Do we make the bells vibrate on some level when we just walk in the room?
Yes, I think it affects, it changes the sound energy that is at work.
I'm also wondering whether the bells will become objects of desire or objects of fear, too.
Yeah, I don't know also, because they have, especially like some of the higher tones, they have something almost violent when they're being struck. So I don't know if people will step back or if they will approach.
We put the bells with the highest tones in the bright room.
Yes.
Together, and they're struck simultaneously, which produces complex oscillations, interferences in the sound waves as down below in the first floor. And we also have a set of triangles, which are also chimes. And so technically they're identical. And they produce also another experience of the same technical, let's say, suite of activities, which is striking metal from the outside.
But there will be a moment of when you will experience the overall composition. You have this kind of fragmented parts that are in these rooms, But then once you're in the main hall, the composition comes together. And that's also an important moment, Bill.
Absolutely. The main hall is where the entire composition is audible. And one of the most important parameters of creating that composition is the decay times of the individual bell strikes, because we have to find a balance between the Gesamt composition and the experience in those individual rooms, because I do believe people will be interested in the decay lengths. They will listen till the end of a strike out of curiosity for the instrument.